most anyone who has studied a foreign language has undoubtedly put some thought into the potential existence of a critical period for language acquisition. I learned my first language, and I don't remember struggling much at all. Why then do I find it more difficult to learn a second? A conclusive answer to this question has massive implications on the optimal approach for adult language learning. But the reality is, due to the nature of the problem, we may never know the answer, and that's what I want to talk about. A little thought experiment that I think can provide a lot of insight into the complexity of this issue is to consider what we would actually need to observe in order to conclusively prove or disprove the existence of a critical period. If we could design a study to provide an answer with absolutely no limitations, what would it entail? Well, I guess we'd have to somehow simulate the process of growing up in some speaking community and provide the experience to adult test subjects. We'd have to make sure that the type of language usually used around babies and children is properly replicated as the study progresses. Adults in the study will have to be fully taken care of, as children don't tend to have the burdens of work and responsibility interfering with any potential language development. The subjects would have to interact with other children, who in turn would have to act as though everything were completely normal. And if all that weren't enough, we'd have to make sure that our adult test subjects aren't exposed to any language of any kind whatsoever before the experiment. Only then, in the case that our test subjects still did not acquire language, could we conclusively prove a critical period to exist. In case it wasn't already obvious, we are never going to conduct this study, as we'd have to violate a lot of human rights in order to make it happen. Pointing out the impossibility of this study may sound as though I'm making an argument against a critical period, using this lack of responsibility and greater time spent with the language as evidence that children aren't built different when it comes to language learning. They just have the convenience of time and exposure on their side. In fact, this is the exact cope that I used up until I took a class on child language acquisition my sophomore year of college, which kind of shattered a lot of what I thought I knew about language. It may seem as though children are getting a lot, whether it be hours of listening to their parents, or simplified child-directed speech that adults often use towards children. From this perspective, it feels as though children should have more than enough data to figure out the grammar and vocabulary of their language. The truth is a bit more messy though. The biggest issue is that, according to what I learned in class, a child's linguistic input doesn't even contain all the information needed to pin down what the grammatical rules of the language are. In other words, there are, in theory, multiple possible variants of a language that are consistent with the available input. The fact that children seem to all arrive at the same set of structures is often used as evidence for an innate language module in the brain. If a child's model of language cannot be derived from the input data they were provided, there must be some information built in filling in the gaps. Now, I understand that this topic may feel like a bit of a detour, but it seems to me that the observation that children have some knowledge not present in their input presents a direct challenge to the idea that language acquisition is simply a function of richness and quantity of input. As for child-directed input, it turns out that this is kind of a culture-specific phenomenon. Even in cultures where it's not used, children nevertheless are successful in acquiring language, so it's certainly not required for acquisition to occur. Children with normal cognitive function, as far as I am aware, are all very successful in acquiring the language they are exposed to. But thinking back to the impossible study, what happens when this exposure doesn't ever occur? Well, unfortunately there are documented cases of this happening. So trigger warning, child abuse. The most well-known example of a child kept in isolation is of a girl called Jeannie. She wasn't exposed to any language from the age of 20 months to 13 years. Despite years of dedicated intervention after her rescue, she still never developed anything close to a full grammar. Now, the issue is that it's hard to be confident about any conclusions drawn from cases like Jeannie's, since abuse and neglect are both confounding factors. A bit of a cleaner and less ethically contentious line of evidence can be drawn from studies involving children born without hearing and their acquisition of sign language. Some parents of deaf children, for one reason or another, may not expose their children to sign language directly from birth. A study observing the effect that age of exposure has on deaf children's acquisition of ASL found that as initial exposure is pushed back, performance in both production and comprehension gets worse. Of the available evidence that we have supporting the existence of a critical period, I find this to be the most convincing. Alright, so that's my opinion, okay? I think that there probably is a critical period, at least for the type of automatic acquisition that children seem to be capable of. This opinion, though, does not seem to be very popular in the language learning community. I feel like most people I see sharing their opinion online tend to not believe in a critical period, and they love to come up with all sorts of ideas to justify and explain the obvious discrepancy in success between child and adult language learners. It's cool to see that these people have confidence, but it is also quite maddening when most of the arguments that I see against the critical period completely miss the point. Every single time that somebody on the internet mentions the critical period, there always has to be some dipshit in the comments that contributes one of the following two arguments. The first goes like this: there can't be a critical period. I didn't start learning English until I was 20, but unless I say otherwise, everyone just thinks I grew up in America. The second one is like this: If children are so much better at learning languages, then why can my 2-year-old barely string a sentence together after a nonstop immersion? I learned basic Chinese in just a few months. These arguments frustrate me to no end, okay, because both of them place all of the emphasis on language learning outcomes and completely ignore the processes that led to those outcomes. There is no doubt in my mind that it is possible for an adult to become completely fluent in any foreign language and be fully indistinguishable from a native speaker, but that is not the point, okay? You can learn to do a lot of difficult things. The brain is amazing like that. The point is that a child's brain carries out this learning automatically, effortlessly, and without the child even being aware. Just because I can feasibly get my brain into a state of knowing Chinese doesn't mean that my brain is capable of doing the same thing as a child's. Look, you can tell me that any adult can be taught some grammatical structures, memorize some words, and within weeks show more competence than a 3-year-old. But the fact of the matter is that the child is not taught anything at all, and certainly does not receive any meta instruction in separate languages. The 3-year-old's mind has extracted the rules of the language and figured out the meanings of a lot of words without any reference other than the pure hard context that accompanies their input. And this happens completely involuntarily without conscious effort on behalf of the child. This, to me, is mind-boggling. When I first started getting into studying Chinese for real, it was my intention to try and learn like a child does. I got really into the Krashen stuff and I watched a lot of Matt vs. Japan videos. I wanted to tap into my brain's natural ability to automatically acquire language upon exposure to comprehensible input. 3 years ago, I even gave a speech in Chinese about this topic, where I argued that adults can learn like children, and I talked about the ways in which my process has been similar to children.
那么我学中文的时候，到底做些什么？我认为听力是最重要的。
Well, as time went by, I definitely experienced success. And it's certainly true that my process differed from that of traditional classroom-based language study. But let's be real here. Despite my intention to acquire language in the same way that children do, pretty much from every angle I look at it, my study of Mandarin has been a completely different process entirely. It doesn't matter if you're focused on immersion and input. As soon as you open up a pop-up dictionary, monolingual or bilingual, you are engaging in an activity that is very much unlike child language acquisition. Even just thinking about some grammar structure, reflecting on its meaning and usage is an active metalinguistic analysis that, as far as I know, children don't need to do. If you come away from this video feeling more confused than when it started, then I'm very sorry. To be honest, I don't think that my personal belief in a critical period is a particularly science-based position. I think it's mostly just a reflection on my own experience as a language learner. Even though I think I've provided myself with the necessary environment for Chinese to just grow in my brain as it does in a child's brain, it simply has not happened. Even if some analysis of Chinese is happening for me behind the scenes without my awareness, and even if I seem to know some things about the language that I didn't explicitly study, these phenomena, I think, can always be linked back to some intentional effort on my part. Whichever way I look at it, this stands in stark contrast to the process of child language acquisition. At the end of the day, if you don't believe me, and you think that you can still acquire languages like a child, then go do it. In fact, I think that everyone trying to learn a language should try it, at least for a bit. Go read the old AJAT stuff and build yourself an immersion environment. Just try to see what your brain picks up. You got nothing to lose, other than time, I guess.